You've tried to awaken your quantum consciousness, yet life keeps repeating itself, as if reality were deaf to your efforts. But the truth hits quietly. You're not blocked by the world outside. You're blocked by the observer inside. Nothing shifts because you keep looking from the same internal vantage point. And the moment that observer stirs, just a fraction, reality stops hiding and finally shows what it has always been. Awakening. Quantum consciousness isn't about mastering quantum physics. It's realizing your perception is the lens shaping every moment you call reality. You aren't living in the world itself, but in the echo of the consciousness observing it. Reality doesn't arrive ready-made. It reveals itself as your awareness expands. And from here on, you'll begin to sense how shifting that inner state changes everything you see. Your quantum consciousness remains dormant for one simple reason. You've been living in a mode that feels like awareness, but operates entirely on memory. Most people assume they are perceiving the present, yet what actually guides their reactions, emotions, and interpretations is an internal archive built long before this moment even began. It's as if your mind quietly runs an old script while convincing you that the script is fresh. The world appears repetitive not because life is limited, but because the observer inside you is recycling the same perceptual lens. You wake up each morning and step into a day that feels familiar, but the familiarity isn't coming from the external world. It comes from the automatic patterns that decide what you notice, what you ignore, and how you translate every signal around you. Quantum consciousness sleeps every time you respond without truly observing, every time your body reacts before your awareness has the chance to witness what's happening. It sleeps when your attention is dragged by habit instead of guided by presence. There is a quiet moment, subtle, almost imperceptible, where every experience is still undetermined, before your mind names it, before your emotions frame it, before your history colors it. That is the moment where quantum consciousness lives. But for most people, that moment is swallowed by the speed of interpretation. You don't see the raw signal, you see what the past tells you the signal means. And so, reality never appears new. It appears filtered, predictable, and strangely closed. The truth is that the observer within you is not neutral. It carries assumptions, expectations, fears, and familiar emotional tones that act like gravitational fields, bending your perception into shapes you've seen before. When you walk into a room already expecting tension, your body stiffens. When you're waiting for disappointment, your attention hunts for subtle cues confirming it. When you believe your life is stagnant, you notice nothing that contradicts that belief. This is why your quantum consciousness feels asleep. The present moment does not get a chance to speak for itself. The past becomes the governing frequency. Your nervous system rehearses old postures. Your thoughts recycle familiar pathways. Your breath follows patterns shaped by moments you no longer even remember. And so, without noticing it, you live in a world narrated by echoes. The present is technically here, but you're seeing it through yesterday. Quantum consciousness awakens only when the observer stops collapsing reality through old frequencies. This isn't about forcing positivity or pretending everything is perfect. It's about realizing that perception is an active process, not a passive one. The way you see something is not merely a reflection of what is there. It is an act that shapes what becomes visible to you. And as long as that act is performed through the lens of who you used to be, you will continue to experience versions of reality that match that identity. Many people try to change their lives by adjusting external circumstances, thinking the new job, new city, new relationship, or new routine will naturally shift their internal state. But without altering the observer, the new environment quickly becomes a slightly rearranged version of the old one. The patterns return. The same emotional weather reappears. The same thoughts wear a new mask. Reality bends back to the familiar because the frequency observing it has not changed. Your quantum consciousness is not asleep because you lack spiritual insight or because you haven't meditated enough. It is asleep because your attention is anchored to the past. Awakening begins the moment you notice the anchor, instead of letting it pull you. It begins when you recognize how much of your life is navigated not through awareness, but through expectation. It begins when you allow yourself to perceive without predicting, to witness without rehearsing, to feel without assuming the meaning in advance. When that shift occurs, even slightly, the observer loosens. The automatic scripts lose their authority. The present widens. And in that widening, your quantum consciousness starts to rise, not as an exotic mystical event, but as the natural expression of awareness freed from memory. The real awakening of quantum consciousness is far simpler, far quieter, and far more radical than most people imagine. It isn't a mystical explosion or a moment of cosmic revelation that suddenly turns you into a different person. Instead, it begins as a shift in the internal state that observes your reality. A shift so fundamental that the world you've been interacting with starts to reorganize itself around a new center of perception. Awakening isn't about learning new concepts. It's about altering the frequency that collapses your moment-to-moment experience. To understand this shift, imagine that your awareness is a lens with a subtle tone, a specific texture. That texture is shaped by your emotional history, your beliefs, your nervous system, your expectations, and the stories you tell yourself about who you are. Most people try to change their lives by rearranging the scenery. New habits, new goals, new affirmations, new decisions. But if the observer behind all these attempts stays the same, the frequency underlying your actions doesn't change. You end up recreating the same outcomes because the identity that perceives reality is repeating its own patterns. Awakening. Quantum consciousness means noticing that the observer itself is not fixed. It's not the personality you've built. It's not the stream of thoughts running through your mind. It's not even your emotional reactions. The observer is the state of awareness that precedes all of that, the silent point where potential turns into perception. When that state shifts, everything else reorganizes. Your intentions, your interpretations, your reactions, and even the possibilities you can access. This is why so few people truly awaken. They try to modify the world, not the internal frequency that shapes the world they see. They wait for external confirmation, hoping that once reality changes, they will finally feel different. But quantum consciousness works in the opposite direction. The internal shift comes first. The external shift is the echo. And this shift is not abstract. It is deeply experiential. It begins the moment you realize that what you call reality is not a solid, predetermined structure. It is a field of probabilities that becomes defined through the quality of your attention. Your mind doesn't simply register what is there. It selects, organizes, filters, and amplifies based on the state of awareness behind it. When your awareness expands, the world expands. When your awareness contracts, the world contracts. The field responds to your inner tone. Awakening. Quantum consciousness requires a kind of honesty that is both liberating and uncomfortable. You begin to see how often you perceive through fear rather than curiosity, through defense rather than openness, through memory rather than presence. You notice how your thoughts attempt to stabilize the familiar instead of allowing something new to emerge. You recognize how your identity is built on patterns designed to maintain predictability. And predictability, while comforting, is the enemy of awakening. It collapses reality into the narrowest version of what it could be. The true awakening begins when you start observing without the automatic need to define. You let a moment breathe before assigning meaning to it. You let an emotion move without interpreting it as a threat. You let uncertainty exist without rushing to control it. This creates a tiny but powerful gap in your perception, a gap where probabilities remain open. In that gap, the observer shifts from mechanical to conscious, and once that shift happens, even subtly, you begin to sense a new dimension of your own being. You notice that you can move through the world with a different internal coherence, one that doesn't depend on external outcomes. You become less reactive because your awareness is no longer collapsing experiences through fear or past conditioning. You start perceiving layers of possibility that were previously invisible. The world becomes less rigid, more responsive, more alive. Awakening quantum consciousness means realizing that reality is not something you stand at a distance from. You are participating in its creation through the state of awareness you bring into each moment. When that state changes, the texture of your life changes, not because the universe suddenly gives you something new, but because you finally become available to what was always there. This awakening is not about escaping the human world. It's about seeing it with the clarity of an observer no longer confined to old frequencies. It is the recognition that the real shift happens within. And once it does, the reality you perceive begins to reveal a depth that was hidden by habit. The simplest way to understand the mechanics behind awakening quantum consciousness is to return to a core principle. Before anything becomes an experience, it exists as a range of possibilities. In physics, this appears as the duality between wave and particle. A particle isn't a particle until it is observed. Before that, it lives as a wave of probabilities, undefined and open. Consciousness operates in a remarkably similar way. Your life, your interactions, your emotional responses, and even the outcomes you call reality emerge from a field of potentials waiting to be collapsed by the quality of your attention. This isn't metaphorical. Your nervous system, your perceptual biases, and your expectations act as filters that determine what becomes visible to you. Two people can stand in the same room and experience entirely different realities because each one collapses the moment through their own internal frequency. Awakening. Quantum consciousness means becoming aware of this collapsing process instead of letting it happen automatically. Most of what you perceive is shaped not by the present, but by predictive coding. Your brain's attempt to anticipate the world before it fully arrives. Your mind constantly tries to reduce uncertainty by projecting past patterns onto new situations. This is efficient for survival, but it blunts perception. You end up seeing what you expect instead of what exists. In physical terms, your attention keeps collapsing the same probability fields because the observer hasn't changed. As long as the internal state remains the same, reality looks repetitive. The moment your awareness expands, the wave returns. Your perception becomes less rigid, less defined by habit, and more capable of registering nuances that were previously filtered out. You experience a subtle widening, as if the world contains more information than you had access to before. This is the early stage of awakening, not an explosion of insight, but the quiet return of possibility. In quantum mechanics, the observer effect is often misunderstood as if observation magically alters reality. But the deeper truth is that observation determines which potential becomes real for you. Your consciousness does something similar. It selects meanings, it chooses interpretations, it stabilizes certain emotional frequencies. Over time, this selection becomes your personal reality. Awakening isn't about gaining new abilities. It's about noticing the role you play and selecting how reality appears. Consider how your attention behaves when you're anxious. It narrows, it scans for threat, it interprets neutral signals as negative. In that state, the world collapses into a more limited, more rigid set of possibilities. Now consider how attention behaves when you're calm, open, or curious. Your perception broadens, you notice details, your interpretations become more nuanced. The world feels larger because your awareness is larger. The wave of probability opens again. Quantum consciousness awakens when you begin choosing the state from which you observe, instead of letting old emotional habits choose for you. The physics behind this is simple. Your internal frequency determines which aspects of reality become available. A rigid frequency collapses a narrow version of life. A coherent frequency collapses a richer one. This is why attempts to manifest through forced thoughts so often fail. Thought alone doesn't change the observer. The underlying frequency, the emotional tone, the internal coherence, the felt sense of awareness, determines how your attention interacts with possibility. If you try to shift reality without shifting the observer, you stay trapped in the same collapsing pattern. The true mechanics of awakening are grounded in this subtle discipline, noticing the moment before collapse. The instant where the experience is still a wave, uninterpreted, unfixed, unclaimed by the past. In that moment, your awareness has the power to choose. You can collapse reality through the familiar lens, or you can hold the wave a little longer, allowing new information to emerge, new emotions to rise, new interpretations to form. When you stretch that moment even slightly, the observer changes. When the observer changes, the field responds. Reality appears more fluid. Possibilities multiply. Patterns that once felt inevitable begin to dissolve. And what emerges is not mystical. It is simply the world finally visible without the distortions of past frequency. This is the simple physics of awakening quantum consciousness. Potential becomes experience through the state of the observer. Shift the observer, and the entire landscape of reality shifts with it. The greatest obstacle to awakening quantum consciousness is not fear, distraction, or lack of spiritual practice. It is identity, specifically the identity you believe you must remain loyal to. Identity feels like a stable foundation, but in truth, it functions as a perceptual cage. It defines what you think is possible, what you believe you deserve, how you interpret events, and how you respond to uncertainty. And because identity shapes the lens through which you observe, it inevitably shapes the reality you collapse. Your current identity was not chosen consciously. It formed gradually through repetition, adaptation, survival, and emotional conditioning. It absorbed the emotional climates you grew up in, the expectations of others, the interpretations of past experiences, and the strategies you used to avoid pain or find acceptance. Over time, these layers hardened into a sense of self, a version of you that feels familiar, predictable, and safe. But this familiar self is not neutral. It has a frequency. And that frequency collapses a particular version of reality again and again. Every time you interact with the world, your identity filters the moment before you even have the chance to fully perceive it. It tells you who you are in relation to the experience. It tells you how you should feel, how you should protect yourself, what you should expect, and what outcomes are likely. Identity acts as an anchor that drags the past into the present, forcing new situations to match old patterns. Even when the external world shifts, the internal observer stays the same, and so reality repeats itself. Awakening quantum consciousness requires loosening this identity, not through force or denial, but through understanding. You begin to see that who you think you are is not actually you. It is a habitual frequency, a collection of interpretations, a familiar emotional signature. It feels stable because it has been rehearsed for years. But stability and truth are not the same. Identity gives you continuity, not clarity. This becomes clear when you notice how your identity defends itself. When an opportunity appears that contradicts your familiar sense of self, you feel resistance. When a perspective challenges your long-held beliefs, you feel threatened. When a new version of you tries to emerge, the old identity interprets it as danger. The discomfort you feel in those moments is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that the observer is trying to shift, and the old frequency is trying to hold its territory. Your identity is the greatest obstacle because it collapses reality into the smallest container you can tolerate. It limits which possibilities you can even perceive. If your identity says you are someone who always struggles, you will collapse experiences that confirm struggle. If your identity says you are someone who must be cautious, you will collapse experiences that justify caution. If your identity says you are someone who isn't meant for expansion, you will collapse experiences that shrink your life. The paradox is that identity feels like the thing protecting you from chaos, when in reality it is the very thing preventing you from accessing the larger spectrum of reality your quantum consciousness is capable of perceiving. Awakening requires stepping beyond the familiar emotional frequencies that define who you believe you are. And this step can feel like stepping into nothingness, because the old identity cannot accompany you. The shift begins when you notice the ways your identity predicts your reactions. You notice how quickly you defend a belief simply because it is yours. You notice how certain emotions rise, not because the situation demands them, but because the identity expects them. You notice that the self you refer to throughout the day is a construct, not a truth. And once you see the construct, even briefly, it begins to loosen. Awakening quantum consciousness means observing reality without the identity's constant interference. It means allowing yourself to experience the world without filtering everything through the version of you you've been carrying for years. It means recognizing that your identity collapses your current reality and that a new reality requires a new observer. The moment you sense that your identity is optional, it begins to lose its power. A new frequency becomes available, one that is not defined by history. In that frequency, perception expands. Possibilities multiply. The world stops reflecting who you have been and begins reflecting who you are becoming. This is the essence of awakening. The observer shifts, and the reality it collapses transforms with it. Your body is not just a physical structure you move through the world with. It is the vault where your unconscious perception lives, the archive where every emotional pattern has been stored, rehearsed and replayed until it becomes automatic. If the mind is the narrator of your experience, the body is the one holding the script. And this is why awakening quantum consciousness is never simply a mental shift. The body must be included, because it is the body that keeps the past alive. Every emotion you've repeated for years, tension, disappointment, vigilance, frustration, resignation, has carved a shape into your physiology. Your breath learned it, your posture memorized it, your muscles adjusted to it, your nervous system organized itself around it. Long before your awareness has a chance to perceive the present moment, your body has already reacted based on the accumulated signals of the past. It fires the same chemistry, anticipating old outcomes, collapsing the same emotional frequency before anything new can emerge. This is why you can intellectually understand the concept of awakening and still feel stuck. The body continues to respond as if nothing has changed. Even when the mind says, "I'm ready for a new reality," the body whispers, "But I only know how to live inside the old one." This tension between mental intention and physiological memory is where most people lose themselves. They mistake the body's old reactions for truth. They believe that because the emotion feels familiar, it must be accurate. They assume the body is signaling danger when it is actually signaling habit. Quantum consciousness cannot awaken while the body is rehearsing the past. The physical patterns must soften for the observer to shift, and this cannot be forced. Your body is not resisting awakening. It is protecting you based on outdated information. It learned to brace itself because once, long ago, it needed to. But those old conditions are no longer here. What remains is the rhythm. The moment you begin to sense this rhythm consciously, something subtle changes. You start noticing how your chest tightens before you react. You notice how your stomach contracts when uncertainty appears. You notice how your shoulders rise as if preparing for invisible impact. These reactions are not about the present moment. They are echoes. They pull your perception into the narrow channel of what your body has survived before, collapsing reality through the emotional frequency your body still carries. Awakening means allowing the body to meet the present instead of dragging the past into it. It means breathing in a way that your nervous system has long forgotten. It means feeling sensations without immediately interpreting them. It means letting an old emotion rise and pass without assigning it a narrative. When you do this consistently, the body begins to update itself. It stops predicting the same outcomes. It stops collapsing the same emotional reality. It starts responding instead of reacting. You may notice moments where your body doesn't contract the way it used to, or where an old trigger doesn't generate the same surge of tension. These moments are not small. They are evidence that the observer inside you is changing. When the body releases old frequencies, perception expands. When perception expands, new possibilities enter awareness. And in that expanded space, your quantum consciousness begins to stir. The body is not the enemy of awakening. It is the threshold. It is the guardian of the state you've lived in so far. And when you learn to read its patterns without letting them control your perception, the past finally loses its authority. The body relaxes, not because life becomes easier, but because awareness becomes clearer. And in that clarity, the dormant consciousness inside you starts to rise, steady and unmistakable. If this message resonated, take a moment to like this and write in the comments, "I'm teaching my body a new frequency." It marks the moment you shift from automatic living to conscious awakening. The moment your body feels the observer changing. The mind doesn't block awakening because it is flawed. It blocks awakening because it is efficient. Its primary function is prediction, anticipating the world before it happens, so you can move through life with as little uncertainty as possible. This predictive mechanism is extraordinary for survival, but limiting for consciousness. It replaces direct perception with assumptions, compressing the vastness of the present into the narrow frame of what it already understands. And when the mind predicts instead of perceiving, quantum consciousness cannot emerge. You've experienced this countless times without noticing. You enter a situation and instantly feel you know what will unfold. You hear a tone of voice and anticipate the meaning behind it. You face a challenge and automatically decide how difficult it will be, long before any evidence appears. The mind fills in the moment with pre-existing templates. It prefers familiarity over truth. And because the observer collapses reality through the quality of its attention, the mind's predictions quickly harden into the experiences you call real. The problem is not that the mind thinks too much, it's that it thinks too early. It reacts before awareness has a chance to expand. It interprets before you can feel. It concludes before you can observe. In doing so, it collapses reality into the smallest version available, the version confirmed by memory. This makes awakening feel impossible for many people. They assume their thoughts reflect the world, when in reality their thoughts often reflect the past. They believe their interpretations are insights, when they are usually predictions disguised as perception. The mind's job is to remove the unknown, and it does this by overlaying old meaning onto new experience. But awakening requires stepping into the unknown. The two impulses conflict. Quantum consciousness awakens in the spaces where the mind pauses, in the moment where you let yourself see without naming, feel without analyzing, hear without concluding. It awakens when you notice the difference between what your mind is projecting and what is actually present. Even a brief moment of recognition breaks the automatic loop. This recognition often feels like a widening, subtle but unmistakable. Your thoughts quiet, not because you suppress them, but because you are no longer fused with them. You experience an instant of direct contact with the moment, unfiltered and unpredicted. In that instant, the observer shifts. And when the observer shifts, the mind begins to lose its absolute authority. The mind does not need to be silenced for awakening to occur. It needs to be repositioned. Instead of sitting in the center of your perception, it moves to the periphery. It becomes a tool rather than a narrator. When the mind is no longer responsible for collapsing reality, awareness takes over. Awareness is spacious, flexible, receptive. It doesn't rush to decide what something means. It allows the wave of possibility to stay open a little longer. This is where quantum consciousness begins to rise, in the space between prediction and perception. When you stop assuming the next moment will resemble the last, you create room for new frequencies to appear. The mind softens, not because it's defeated, but because it's no longer defending the past. And in that softening, the reality you've been rehearsing for years finally expands into what it truly could be. Vibrational coherence is often spoken about as if it were a mystical state reserved for deep meditation or transcendent moments. But in truth, it is far more grounded and far more essential to awakening quantum consciousness. Coherence is what happens when your thoughts, emotions, and energy stop competing with one another. It is the moment when the internal noise quiets enough for perception to become accurate. Without coherence, the observer collapses reality through distortion. With coherence, the observer collapses reality through clarity. Most people live in a state of internal fragmentation. The mind wants one thing, the emotions expect another, and the body reacts as if the past is still happening. This dissonance produces a scattered frequency that keeps awareness contracted. Even when you try to awaken, the signals within you are not synchronized enough for a new perceptual state to take hold. You think expansively, but feel defensive. You imagine possibilities, but carry the physiology of old limitations. You try to be present, yet your energy is still entangled with past experiences. In this fragmented state, the observer cannot stabilize. Your attention flickers between fear and hope, between memory and possibility, between vigilance and curiosity. The world appears inconsistent because the internal frequency perceiving it is inconsistent. This is why people experience brief flashes of insight that quickly fade. The insight is real, but coherence hasn't yet formed to sustain it. Coherence is not created through thought. It emerges when your internal systems begin moving in the same direction, when your breath aligns with the pace of your awareness, when your emotional tone aligns with your intention, when your nervous system stops preparing for danger long enough for your perception to widen. In coherence, your internal signals no longer contradict each other. They reinforce each other. They amplify clarity. When coherence forms, something subtle but powerful happens. Your perception stops being reactive. You begin to sense the moment before your mind interprets it. You feel the world instead of predicting it. You experience yourself without the distortion of defensive patterns. Awareness becomes stable, not because you force it to be, but because nothing inside you is pulling in the opposite direction. This stability is the doorway to quantum consciousness. It allows you to hold a moment open long enough for new possibilities to emerge, instead of collapsing instantly into old interpretations. In coherence, your attention becomes a precise instrument. It doesn't chase noise. It doesn't contract at the first sign of uncertainty. It doesn't collapse the wave prematurely. It rests, observes, and allows reality to reveal information that you would miss in a fragmented state. Coherence also strengthens your ability to choose your internal frequency. When your system is aligned, you are no longer at the mercy of inherited emotions or automatic reactions. You can shift into curiosity more easily. You can soften tension without forcing it. You can hold a new emotional tone without being pulled back into old rhythms. Every part of you begins to move toward the same perceptual direction, and the observer becomes unified. A coherent internal state collapses a coherent external reality. You begin noticing opportunities you once filtered out. You interpret challenges with greater intelligence. You access insights that were previously buried under noise. The world feels more responsive because your awareness becomes more attuned to the subtle signals that shape experience. This is why vibrational coherence is the true gateway to awakening. It is not a technique or a philosophy. It is the internal alignment that allows quantum consciousness to operate without interference. When coherence stabilizes, the observer becomes clear. And when the observer becomes clear, reality starts revealing itself, not as a projection of the past, but as an open field of possibility you are finally able to perceive. The collapse of the old identity is not a dramatic event. It is a quiet, persistent shift that happens inside the observer long before anything changes in the external world. People often imagine a ritual of awakening as something elaborate, but the real ritual is internal. It is the moment you stop letting your past self decide how you perceive the present. Awakening quantum consciousness is not about adding anything new to you. It is about releasing the frequency that has been collapsing the same reality over and over again. Your old identity has been performing a single function for years, protecting continuity. It maintains familiar emotional tones, familiar interpretations, familiar reactions. Even when you long for change, the identity you've carried responds with the only patterns it knows. This is why waking up feels difficult. The identity is not malicious. It is simply loyal to its own survival. It believes the familiar is safe even when the familiar keeps your consciousness asleep. The ritual of awakening begins when you start witnessing this identity instead of acting from it. That witnessing breaks the automatic link between stimulus and reaction. You notice irritation rising, but you no longer merge with it. You notice fear tightening your chest, but you don't interpret it as a command. You notice the urge to defend yourself, and suddenly you realize that the urge belongs to the old identity, not to you. The moment you can observe a pattern without becoming it, the pattern begins to lose its authority. This is the collapse, not destruction, but disidentification. Your old emotional rhythms will still appear, especially in situations that once shaped you. But instead of reacting automatically, you begin meeting them with a different frequency. That shift in frequency interrupts the old identity's momentum. It disrupts the predictable cascade of thought, emotion, and physiology that used to define your responses. Awareness takes the place of habit, and the reality you collapse becomes less bound by your history. This interruption is the heart of the ritual. It doesn't need candles, words, or ceremony. It requires presence, the willingness to stay open long enough for a new observer to emerge. When you sense an old reaction forming, pause internally. Give the moment a little more space than usual. Feel the impulse without acting on it. Allow the wave of possibility to remain uncollapsed just a few seconds longer. In that small opening, the observer changes. As the old identity collapses, a strange sensation often appears, a mix of vulnerability and expansion. Vulnerability because the familiar self is dissolving. Expansion because the perceptual limits that identity maintained are loosening. You begin to sense reality more directly, without the interpretations that once filtered everything. Your nervous system starts responding to the present instead of reenacting the past. Your decisions become simpler, cleaner, less tangled in old narratives. Eventually, the old identity doesn't feel like you anymore. It becomes a memory, not a home. And in its absence, you discover a state of consciousness that is not defined by repetition, but by presence. The observer becomes lighter, more spacious, more accurate. You stop collapsing reality from fear, expectation, or emotional residue. You collapse it from awareness. That is the true ritual of awakening, the gentle, continuous release of who you were, so that who you actually are can finally become the one who observes. There is a version of you that is already awake, not as a metaphor, but as a real, perceptible frequency that your awareness can attune to. You've sensed it at unexpected moments, when clarity cuts through confusion, when presence dissolves anxiety, when you feel an inner steadiness that has no obvious source. These moments are not accidents. They are glimpses of the part of you that perceives without the distortions of old identity, emotion, or memory. Awakening. Quantum consciousness is not about inventing this version of yourself. It is about learning to operate from the frequency where it already exists. Think of this awakened self as a point on the spectrum of your own awareness. It's not separate from you, not mystical, and not waiting in some distant future. It is simply the version of your consciousness that is not collapsed by fear, expectation, or prediction. It sees reality as it is, rather than as the past has conditioned you to see it. This version of you doesn't need external reassurance to stay centered. It doesn't need the world to cooperate to remain coherent. It is grounded in a kind of internal neutrality that allows perception to stay wide and precise. In quantum terms, this awakened self exists as a frequency, a stable pattern of awareness that you can align with. When your attention shifts into that frequency, your perception changes immediately. You become less reactive because the observer is no longer entangled with old emotional signatures. You become more receptive because the mind stops collapsing the moment into predetermined meaning. You begin to sense possibilities that are invisible when your awareness is contracted. This alignment is not forced. It's not created through affirmation or imagination. It emerges naturally when the noise of old identity quiets, when the body stops rehearsing outdated emotional rhythms, and when the mind loosens its grip on prediction. As the internal interference fades, you start noticing the presence of a deeper observer that was always there. It feels like stepping into a version of yourself that is clearer, quieter, and more spacious, yet unmistakably you. What's powerful is that this awakened version of you perceives differently. It doesn't treat uncertainty as a threat. It treats it as potential. It doesn't cling to familiar emotional patterns. It meets the moment without preloading meaning. It doesn't collapse reality through fear, it collapses reality through coherence. And because perception determines possibility, your external world begins to reflect the qualities of this awakened frequency. Clarity, steadiness, and sometimes an almost uncanny sense of synchronicity. There are moments when you slip into this frequency without effort, moments of deep presence, unexpected calm, or sudden insight. These glimpses matter. They show that the awakened observer is not something you must build from scratch. It is already functioning within you. The work is simply learning to stay there long enough for it to become your home instead of a passing state. Over time, as you return to this frequency more often, the contrast between your old and awakened selves becomes unmistakable. You feel when you've fallen back into the identity that collapses reality through habit. You feel when your body is replaying the past. You feel when your mind is predicting instead of perceiving. And you feel when the awakened observer steps forward again, widening the moment, softening the edges, revealing what was always present beneath the noise. This version of you is not aspirational. It is structural. It is the consciousness that emerges when you stop collapsing your reality through old frequencies. It is the you that sees clearly, the you that perceives accurately, the you that exists right now, waiting for your awareness to tune itself to the frequency where awakening becomes the natural way you experience the world. The real proof of awakening does not arrive when your life becomes easier, when circumstances suddenly align, or when a wave of clarity washes over everything. Those moments can happen, but they are not the evidence. The true sign that your quantum consciousness has awakened is far quieter and far more profound. Your internal frequency stops being shaped by what happens outside of you. The world no longer dictates your state. You begin to perceive instead of react, observe instead of collapse, and remain centered even when reality hasn't yet reorganized itself around your new awareness. Before awakening, your emotional state is entangled with external outcomes. A conversation, a setback, a misunderstanding, a moment of uncertainty. Each event pulls your frequency up or down. Your internal world behaves like an echo of your environment. This is the normal human pattern, but it is also the signature of an observer that has not yet awakened. The mind predicts trouble, the body reenacts old emotional responses, and identity interprets everything through the lens of its history. Reality appears to be causing your inner experience, but it is actually your inner state collapsing reality in predictable ways. When awakening begins, this automatic entanglement loosens. You notice a subtle but unmistakable shift. The moment external reality tries to pull you into an old frequency, something inside you pauses instead of collapsing. The familiar emotional surge rises, yet there is a gap, an inner stillness that wasn't there before. You feel the reaction, but you are no longer governed by it. This gap is the first undeniable proof that the observer has changed. With time, this stability becomes more consistent. You stop assuming that every sensation requires interpretation. You stop letting old emotional signatures define new experiences. You recognize the mind's predictions without mistaking them for truth. The external world loses its power to control your internal coherence because your awareness is no longer collapsing reality through fear or habit. It is collapsing reality through presence. The ultimate evidence of awakening is the ability to maintain your internal frequency even when nothing outside you has shifted yet. The old identity expects immediate confirmation. It wants external proof that the new observer is working. But awakening does not produce instant results because external reality reflects old frequencies until the new one stabilizes. This is why the early stage of awakening feels paradoxical. Your perception is clearer, but your circumstances may still resemble the past. The old world lingers, not because you are failing, but because reality takes time to reorganize around a new observer. The awakened state becomes unmistakable precisely in those moments. You remain steady even while the external field lags behind. You no longer collapse back into old emotional patterns just because your environment hasn't caught up yet. You hold the new frequency without needing proof. This is the moment where your quantum consciousness is undeniably awake. You know you have awakened when your internal world becomes self-generated rather than reactive, when clarity persists in the presence of uncertainty, when you can sense multiple possibilities instead of narrowing your perception to the safest one, when the moment expands even while circumstances remain the same, when awareness, not memory, becomes the source of your perception. The real proof of awakening is not the transformation of your reality, it is the transformation of the observer. And once that transformation is stable, the reality you experience begins to shift, not as a reward, but as a natural consequence of a new consciousness, finally seeing the world as it truly is. When quantum consciousness awakens, you realize you were never changing the world. You were learning to see it without the distortions of your past. Reality becomes clearer, quieter, truer. Resistance dissolves, perception expands, and the observer stands free from old frequencies. And in that freedom, The world finally appears as it has always been, open, responsive, and alive to your awareness. If you're ready to stabilize this new perception, explore Awaken Quantum Consciousness, the Observer's Manual, and step into the Quantum Awakened Collective. And if you reach the end, write "I'm shifting the observer" in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the next expansion.